Welcome to my session. I am Qymana Botts. I am presenting documentation. Uh, why and how to do it now, or the why, the how to do it now, which is the less the funner title. Like I said a couple seconds ago, my name is Qymana Botts. You can find me on Twitter as at Qymana on a quest. You can find me on Drupal, basically Drupal Slack, Drupal chat, all the Drupal things as Qymana and then B. So we are going to talk about documentation today. On our magical trip through the land of documentation, this will be our agenda for today. First, we're going to do some introductions. Then we're going to talk about why documentation is important. And then after that, we will get into exactly what documentation is and what makes it good or bad. Then we'll chat about what goes in your docs, where to keep them, and how to go about writing them. Following that, we're going to talk about common points that the documentation naysayers bring up and how to get folks on board to writing documentation and maintaining documentation on your team. And then finally, I'll leave you with a couple of resources and articles, etc., on the subject of documentation, just for your viewing pleasure. So, hi again. Hello, fancy folks. It is 4:30 in the morning in Indiana, where I am. So I hope you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. So I am Qymana Botts, as I've said so many times before. I am currently a software engineer at Nerdery in Chicago. For my wedding, I had a whirly ball and laser tag wedding. So we were driving bumper cars and shooting each other with laser guns. I ripped my wedding dress. I'm very proud of that fact. I'm currently working on a board game based on my two dogs pictured in that picture and not presently with me in my office, which is really unfortunate. I feel very lonely. And my default mood is aggressively grateful. I am so happy to be here. And I am just real stoked. I love talking about documentation, to be honest. And I'm just always really excited to participate in any Drupal community events. So yeah. Like I said before, I work at Nerdery. It's pretty swell. We're based in Minnesota, but we have offices in Chicago and Phoenix, as well as some remote people, especially now. We're actually hiring Drupal people, so you all should hit me up and we'll chat. If you're looking for job stuff. I'm not sure how international things work, but if you are able to work in the US, definitely hit me up. But yeah, Nerdery takes companies from today into their digital future and works at the leading edge of strategy, design, and technology to help clients evolve and thrive. So yeah, talk to me if that's a thing that you are into, perhaps. I don't know. So next up on our agenda, we're going to go through the moment you've all been waiting for, the most riveting edge of your seat subject known to man, documentation, blah, 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 blah. I'm very tired, so the air horns help keep me awake. So what is documentation? Documentation, it is a very broad concept, right? It has many forms. It can be in the form of code comments to wikis to very different things. Some argue that code and APIs themselves are forms of documentation. But the purpose of documentation is to provide information about how a system functions and also the context around the system. Documentation can, like I said, be presented in many different ways and have many different purposes. So depending on the audience, that it's meant to consume the documentation, or the goals of what you're trying to communicate, or the context in which the documentation is being consumed. The same feature can have vast differences in how it's documented depending on these different things. So if I were to build out a feature, for example, that if I were to build out like a content type, for example, and this content type was available as like an API endpoint, but also like the documentation for a CMS user that might be like filling in all of the content, like a Drupal site builder, might be very, very different from the content or from the documentation from like an architectural standpoint, from technical documentation. So there's a lot of different ways that you can even like present the same subject in different ways across different types of documentation. Excuse me. So for the purposes of our discussion today, we're going to break documentation down into how docs and why docs. How docs are there to provide information about how something operates, and why docs provide information about like the reasoning behind something or the context around it. So for some people that see code itself as documentation, they would say that code is a source of truth, but it doesn't always tell the whole story. For someone that didn't write the code, they don't have time to decipher the code. It might be like complex. They don't want to read the code, or they don't have access to the code. So like adding these types of documentation provides that necessary information for someone to glean that information without having to like dig through and decipher a bunch of code. So the 5 W's of documentation. Who should be writing documentation? Well, that answer is everyone should be writing documentation. Everyone on your team can contribute to creating good documentation, no matter if your role is technical or non-technical, or if you're new to a team, or if you've been on there for like years or whatever. There's something you can contribute, and there is something that you can benefit from writing down, probably. I have encountered very few teams that have complete and robust documentation, and chances are that no matter where you are on your team or what role you take, you probably have something to contribute to documentation. If you do something that is likely to be done by another person, write it down. That's like the easiest little benchmark. If you do something that it's a process and it's likely to be repeated, especially if it's something that you do very frequently, take an opportunity to write it down. It doesn't have to be like the greatest technical detail, as long as you're communicating the information that is super necessary, right? That is kind of the point. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a message that my audio is dropping out. Boop, boop, boop. Can everybody hear me? Cool, great. So yeah, if you do something that you're likely to repeat, or that someone else is probably going to do, write it down. That is probably the easiest way that you can contribute to documentation. What should you document? Start by asking yourself these questions. What do you need to know in order to do your job day to day? Like, what is like the basic kind of information that you need to know in order to do your job? What does your team need to know in order to function effectively between the two of them, between everyone. And in order to work together cohesively as a team, what do you need to know? And what are the areas of friction or ambiguity in my workflow? Are there areas in your work that everyone is kind of like making assumptions on? Everyone has to kind of just like guess or use their best judgment consistently. Those are areas that might benefit from you documenting. So what should you document? This is kind of like a non-exhaustive list. If from a technical side, you might want to document your environment setup, your Git workflow, any custom code that you have, any development workflows that you're taking. How do you go from, I have a feature that I'd like to build out, and how do you like build that? Like what does that process look like? And then from a non-technical perspective, you can document ticket workflow. Do you use Jira or Teamwork or any number of things there? Who are your points of contact on the team? Do you have a project manager? Do you have a client? Do you have a client that like a client owner or a product owner or something like that? What are your team norms? Do you have like consistent expectations on your team, consistent behaviors that everyone follows? Do you have, what are the expectations for each role? What do you expect your leads to do? What do you expect your like architect or your feature developers to do? What are your internal processes? How do you go about using the tools that you use as a team? Where should my documentation go? The short answer is it should go where people can find it. The longer answer is that it depends. There's no hard, fast rule for this. You want the documentation to go where whoever it's directed at is going to find it the easiest. It doesn't make sense to put a bunch of effort into documenting or writing a bunch of documentation that no one is going to find, right? You want your documentation to be as close to the thing that you're documenting as possible, or as it makes sense to the audience that you're trying to reach. So if, for example, going back to our content type example from earlier, I wouldn't put like the how-to for like adding content to my content type in a README that's like in my code. I would put that maybe as like a wiki for like non-technical users. Although like perhaps for like my developers or technical people, I might throw something into the README that's like, this is how this is structured. This is like the, these are the types of data that are going into each field, all that kind of stuff. So when should I write documentation? Now. You probably should have already done it before. The long answer is get in the habit of documenting your work. It is an ongoing process, and it takes some practice to kind of get in the flow of doing it. The more ingrained it becomes in your process, the easier it becomes to maintain. So if you make it a priority now and you get in the habit of making it a priority, it will continue to be a priority, and you'll be able to, it won't take time. It'll just be part of your process, and you'll become more efficient at doing it. There are, if your team is anything like literally any team I've ever been on, there's a lot of undocumented stuff that probably could benefit from someone taking a close eye and sitting down and really like looking at it and like writing down like, what is this about? I see question. in the chat, and we will actually get to talking to people who don't want to buy in. So yeah. When should I write documentation? If you write documentation right after you've completed a task, it's fresh in your head. So going back to what I was talking about earlier, especially if there's like a thing that you do frequently, right? Or if there's a piece of code or a feature that you've just very recently built out, or if there's a process that you've just gone through, just write it down in quick bullet points. It's already fresh in your head, and especially from like the code perspective, or like from a feature perspective, if coming from a technical perspective, if there's a thing that you've just built out, or a task that you've just completed, it's likely that like your environment is still like largely set up for that process. So you can take screen caps and stuff, although screen caps are they may have a tendency to go stale. So again, when you write documentation, you want to add just enough like to get the point across, or like to communicate the pertinent information, but not so much that it's going to go stale. Why should I write documentation? Having good documentation is going to do so much to increase your team's efficiency and improve the way that they work together, and also just provide a much better understanding and a much more holistic understanding of the platform, so that the knowledge of like the project and the platform that you're working on is not just stuck within like 2 people. So it helps mitigate areas of ambiguity, and it helps to minimize the assumptions, and also like the time that it takes the time and mental energy that it takes to like make these decisions. And it also raises something called the bus factor, or the lottery factor, which is a little bit nicer, where if your key team members, like how many team members would it take to win the lottery and just be like, I'm done working, I'm gonna like walk out, I don't have to work anymore because I have all this money now, and goodbye. How many team members would have to do that before your project just completely falls apart, before you lose someone that has like a bunch of like knowledge just within their own brain that isn't documented anywhere? So that is the bus or lottery factor. So again, why should you write documentation? Imagine that you have a new team member and they're setting up their local environment, or like they're onboarding onto the project, and they go to onboard and set up their environment, and they follow the steps in like a README or something, and they go and grab the most recent versions of all the things that they need to set up their environment. And boom, they encounter a really bad error. What do? Without solid documentation, they go into like their messaging, like Slack or something, and then they Google the error for Google for the solution to that error. A couple minutes later, someone responds with a solution. Not to worry, it's a common thing that the team has encountered before, which means that like the new teammate wasn't using the right version of Node or something like that. Like, and then that solves a problem, so that they continue their process. They can set up again, and then bam, another error. They post in Slack, and then they get another couple of solutions. They try some stuff that they found on the internet and wait for a response. And then there's another known. It turns out to be another known issue. Like there's a cost to having people have to write questions and stuff like that. There's a cost to not documenting things properly, and having people have to context switch from doing their feature work and then answering questions that everyone already knows the answer to. So why write documentation? There's many like just quality of life reasons, but also like at the end of the day, we're doing this this code stuff, and we're doing all this Drupal stuff largely to like turn a profit. There's a financial aspect associated with it, and the more time we can spend solving new problems instead of solving problems that we've already solved before, the more effectively we're going to be working towards funds and like using whatever funding that we have. Next up on our agenda, how to write good documentation. Good documentation is concise and simple and navigable. So you don't want to like overdo the documentation. You don't want to like put a bunch of information that's irrelevant or might go stale. You want to be able to find the information. You want to be able to parse the information, and you want to be able to like do it in an amount of time that is not excessive. So you want to decouple how docs, which are likely to change. Remember, that's those how a thing functions, and why docs, which are less likely to change. You don't want to over document, prioritize quality over quantity. You want to have good, concise documentation, and it's better to have like very clear, defined documentation rather than having a bunch of documentation that no one's going to use, and in a format that's really hard to swallow. So one approach is the rubber duck approach. So you can talk through the thing that you're documenting and write it down like word for word what you're saying. Voice recording and text to speech to text is really great for this. It's a thing that I do quite frequently, where I will just be working on a feature, and I will just verbally say like, okay, first, in order to do this, you have to log in as an administrator and then navigate to the structure and content types, blah, 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 whatever. And as you talk it out, you might find areas that you are, that need more clarification. And also like talking out the steps of something, you're less likely to like kind of ramble on if you're just like verbally going through what the steps are to complete a task, or talking about things. And also you can always go back and edit. The API approach. So documenting everything that is publicly accessible in an API. This is for technical users especially. Usually there is description, and then example, and then edge cases. So again, trying not to over document. You want to make sure there is an understandable and concise description about a thing, and then give a couple examples of how that thing is used. And then if there are any edge cases, go ahead and like outline the edge cases so that people know if there's like any known edge cases that are going to like slip them up. Getting feedback. Cunningham's law. I live by this. The best way to get the right answer on the internet is to not ask a question, it's to post the wrong answer. Sometimes it's easier to contribute if there is something someone can point to and be like, no, that's wrong. I'm a firm believer in Cunningham's law. Some of the most effective documentation sessions that I've had with my teams have been, I will just throw together some bubblegum duct tape nonsense, just a very, very bad skeleton of documentation about a process. And then I will show it to people and be like, what do you think? And then they'll be like, no, that's wrong. But they'll be very nice about it. Usually if it's on your team, they'll be nice about it. On the internet, people might not be as nice. But it gives people a very good foundation to start from, as opposed to coming together as a team and trying to like from thin air create some kind of documentation because everyone's imagining something different in their head. So if you give them a starting point, then it's much easier for people to like give their feedback and for that feedback to be meaningful rather than for the feedback to be them trying to guide someone to what the image is in their head. Okay, getting people on board. So people know that documentation is important. Everyone has generally accepted this. Now, do people put effort towards documentation? No, not as much, not as much as they should. And it should be more of a priority for more people, but it generally gets pushed out in favor of feature work or things that like you can charge people for. At the end of the day, it's not one of the fanciest things. It's not glamorous like building out new features. So one of the biggest hurdles to convincing is convincing people of the value of documentation. Sometimes the best way is to start and just write documentation. An example from my own experience is, again, going back to what I said earlier, excuse me. Okay, going back to what I said earlier, if there's like a thing that you do and you're likely to repeat or someone else is likely to do that thing, just write it down. That's a thing that I tend to do, especially if I'm like onboarding onto a project and not, and there's like the thing that I'm doing is not documented. And then what will often happen is that someone will be like, how do I do this thing? And you'll be like, oh, I'm so glad you asked. And then you'll just pull out your documentation, or you post it, ideally post it where people are going to see it. And then as you continue to do that, as you start just like documenting things on your own, then eventually there's like a bigger kind of well of information, and then again people can point at it and be like no or yes, and that's great. But also like bother people about it. Just be very relentless in being like, hey, we should document things, let's write documentation. Hey, I wrote this documentation, what do y'all think? And keep it at the front of people's minds. It can be tedious, but it's well worth it. If they say, I don't want to put effort towards documentation because it goes stale too quickly, you say, focus on documenting the immutable. What's not likely to change on your project? Things like your internal processes, things like your Git workflow, stuff on your project that's like pretty set in stone, like document that. If your project or if your career is anything like mine, there's some stuff to document that isn't going to change, that could really, like, the team could very much benefit from having documented. So there's probably something. If they say, oh, it goes stale too quickly, find something that's not stale or very, very unchanging and document that. If they say, I didn't become a developer so I could write words, I want to write code. You say, writing documentation helps you focus on the code you're writing by helping to eliminate confusion about the code that you wrote before. Like whiny developers that don't want to write documentation, you can tell them that, like, if you write your documentation, then you can focus on writing new code rather than having to answer questions about stuff that you wrote a while ago. It's that simple. And also, writing words is part of being a developer. Like, it's your job. Do your job. If they say taking time to write documentation is expensive, you say, you know what else is expensive? Context switching, having to stop what I'm doing to answer questions that have already been answered, repeating yourself, dealing with blockers, fixing preventable mistakes. These are all very expensive things that can be mitigated by writing good documentation. Writing docs is very important. And yeah, like it's not only important, but it can save, it's an investment that can save you so much money, because you're not wasting money having to stop what you're doing to answer questions that have already been answered. And that's just the long and short of it. Yeah. Final thoughts. Simple, concise, accessible documentation can make the difference between hours of headaches and a smoother, more efficient working experience. It is an investment that yields returns in every aspect of the documentation process. Do it now, and the future you will be glad you did. Honestly, cannot stress this enough. Documentation it is more than just a project, like a nice thing for your project. There is a mental effort that is sorry, again, it's 5 o'clock in the morning now, but there's a extreme mental effort that comes with having to figure out stuff and make decisions where those questions could have been solved or answered in good documentation. And especially, I'm just speaking from like my heart now, but like in situations where like things are just kind of like stressful, sometimes you're just like done. Just your brain is a little bit fried. Having docs there to like lean on will it's very helpful, and it helps stave a lot of stress and helps to stave off the pain of burnout. So on top of all of the other things that we've discussed today, there is more than just a financial and like practical aspect. There's like, and for some people, I guess, for people like me, there is an emotional aspect, an emotional security that comes with having good documentation. It's very important. So consider doing it and bother your team about it. And I will share my slides. But here are some great articles and books and stuff that are resources. And now I'm going to go to questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Qymana. Your brilliant talk on a difficult topic that's obviously not that much talked about. We do have a couple of questions. So I will skip my own one. So Adriano asked, how do you handle the time spent in writing documentation during the estimation process of an activity?
Conventional wisdom says bump up your estimate. In a perfect world, writing documentation is part of the task, and people just like have forgotten that. So in estimation, try to like pad your estimation with time to write the appropriate documentation. Just bump up your estimation, make it a little bit. Oh, it's better to overestimate and be able to write the documentation than underestimate and not leave room for it, because again, it is part of the process of writing good code and writing like these features and stuff like that. So try doing that. That's something I've in the past had success with.
That's great. So I'm not sure I can say that right. Tassos Koutlas asked, any best practice to onboard a technical team in thinking along these lines about documentation?
Any best practice to onboard a technical team and thinking along those lines? So I guess in my experience, one thing that I've done recently with my team is to compile a list of like pain points and things that would improve, or like things that like hinder developer quality of life. And it turns out that a lot of the things that were messing or like throwing off the team had to do with like things not being documented, especially for people that were newer or had recently onboarded and stuff. And so like if you take the time and outline the I would say that like outlining the not only like the like how to do it, but like the actual impact, and like making that clear is a good step to getting people to think about documentation, and also like presenting different forms of documentation. There, like these articles, there's a couple of like very good examples and stuff, and I think getting people to understand the value and then showing them examples of how to write documentation. I think UML is another, it's a little dense, but showing them examples is also really effective. Once they grasp that like there is a tangible impact to not doing it. So yeah.
Thank you. And another question from Eli Stone. How can you best try to make sure documentation does not become stale?
I would say for that, again, focus the majority of your effort on things that are not going to change, and also focus on the why docs. So focus on the surrounding context rather than like the main, like the code itself that's like maybe going to be changed or updated or whatever. But if you get into the habit of, if you update a thing, update the documentation. Again, like part of this is like making sure it's ingrained in your process. And so getting into the habit of like ensuring that when things change, everything that is surrounded from that changes. So like if you update the code, update the documentation associated with that code. But I would again say that like the focus, like putting the focus more on like focusing your efforts on documenting the immutable, and then try, if you don't over document, then it's easier to maintain and update documentation that is liable to change.
Okay, that's great. And any suggestions asked for by Christopher on platforms that host documentation, because the team needs to create docs?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that you don't have, so my team uses Confluence, which is part of, I think, like some kind of enterprise suite. But there are many like documentation platforms. Also, GitBooks is good, or GitHub has like a really good documentation platform that's like pretty accessible. Honestly, you could use like Google Docs, but yeah, like there are a few. I will add them to my resources. Bookstack, yes, someone added Bookstack to the, that's a very good one. Yes,
that's great. And I think we've just got one last question. So we'll go for Reinhardt. Wanted to know any tips for excessive documentation. So I presume we're talking about yes, cleaning up deprecated things and trimming out the unnecessary.
I would start with prioritizing what like what, first get an audit of like what documentation exists, and then prioritize like what is going to be the most useful thing that exists in this documentation. And then like you're going to have to go through all of it and like filter it out, but like
Yeah.
start at the
Okay.
most relevant point and then
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Qymana, and it's a great talk. Have a good day.
Thanks.